carbon price mechanism, also known as the carbon tax by the media, was introduced in Australian legislation in 2012 in order to reverse the effects of climate change. By taxing 500 of Australia's largest polluters of CO2 emissions $23 per tonne. This documentary will explore this issue and its various complexities. Is carbon tax necessary? Is its purpose even achievable? And how will the introduction of this carbon tax impact our environment, society and economy? Climate change has been the fundamental aspect for the introduction of the government's carbon tax. After decades of research by scientists and government bodies, such as the IPCC and the UN, have both indicated that the global temperature is rising, mainly due to human activities. This graph shows the correlation between the global temperature and CO2 emissions. We can see that as the y-axis of CO2 increases, so does our average temperature, specifically after the Industrial Revolution in the 1940s. Despite scientific data presented, there are many scientists, much like Malcolm Roberts, who believe that this information is misleading in order to persuade people into a carbon tax.
Corrupted in two senses. One is inadvertently through sloppiness and not meeting standards, tampering of the data to fabricate unusual warming. And even then, it is still not unusual in terms of the rate or amount.
This statement released by the CSIRO clearly highlights that a carbon tax is only a domestic step in an international goal. This map shows the CO2 emissions of every country. The redder colour indicates the highest CO2 emissions of up to 1,600 million tonnes. We can see this is the United States and Asia. As we move to the chart, the biggest CO2 emitters are China at 21% and the United States at 20%. Australia at 16th place only emits 1.3%. An Australian carbon tax in a global perspective will reduce a small amount of CO2, especially with these larger emitters not in favour of a carbon tax. Scientists believe that CO2, among other pollutants, is responsible for the greenhouse effect. To gain a better understanding of the greenhouse effect, let us consider this experiment. Let's imagine that jug 1, that is filled with water and ice cubes, represents the Earth without any greenhouse gases within its atmosphere, and that jug number 2 represents the Earth also with the same amount of water and ice, but has a plastic bag around it, which represents the build-up of the greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide within the Earth's atmosphere. After 3 hours of both jugs being in the hot sun, the temperature of jug number 2 is 36.2 degrees Celsius. The temperature of jug number 1 is 32.1 degrees Celsius. The temperature of jug number 2 is much higher, even though the plastic bag was shielding the ice water from the sun. The plastic bag, like greenhouse gases, trap and absorb the sun's heat instead of reflecting like jug number 1. The air inside the jug number 2 remains heated. This experiment is an example of what scientists believe is happening to the Earth's atmosphere as we speak, as a result of the build-up of greenhouse gases. So how will the implementation of a carbon tax affect the environment and scientific predictions like climate change and the greenhouse effect? Under carbon tax legislation, the government aims to cut CO2 emissions by 159 million tonnes a year. Ecologist Leslie Hughes indicates the need for a carbon tax.
We were concerned about global warming and its impacts on reefs, so we've asked governments around the world to get serious about global warming because of the threat to coral reefs.
Even though there may be a need for a reduction of CO2 emissions, the carbon tax and its estimated reductions are not enough to reverse the effects of climate change. Even if carbon tax goals are reached, it is still not enough for the Earth's atmosphere to reach stabilisation. According to Tony Abbott, carbon tax will boost Australian economy by providing 1.2 million jobs and sustainability. However, master builders say carbon tax will damage the construction industry by driving up cost and reducing demand. Clearly shown in the estimates, constructions will be at a loss of $500 million by 2020. The carbon tax introduced in the European Union has been commended by many people, such as environmental scientist Diana Crutzen. Through a carbon tax, the European Union has reduced CO2 emissions by 20%. This map shows all European nations under the emissions trading scheme. However, when assessing the overall implications, it is not as successful in an economic perspective. The first 2 years of the ETS had no market value and led to over $24 million loss in financial corruption. The carbon tax will indirectly affect Australian society by causing a consumer increase. In the Treasury report, it was estimated an increase of 0.7% in consumer goods. However, these figures are modelled at a carbon tax of only $23 per tonne. This figure will increase as the cost goes to a global market, providing uncertainties in the credibility of these figures. This report looks at society expenditure as a macro scale and fails to assess it in a micro scale. The Australian Bureau of Statistics show the average household income to be on decline since 2005, and therefore the cost of living increases and disposable income decreases. There will definitely be a significant strain. Information from the government is often filtered to maintain public support. Whether or not climate change is happening, based on scientific predictions, we just have too much to lose if we don't take actions. Ecosystem, habitats, and our lives. Through many months of research, it is clear that the carbon tax will be a domestic step in promoting similar actions globally. After all, this is a global battle. Even though the carbon tax aims to reduce CO2 emissions, overall, this does not limit the CO2 production. It only provides an economic incentive. This clearly shows that the success of a carbon tax relies heavily on the discretion of a company. So how much do you trust that Australian polluting companies will do the right thing? I believe that the government should provide sanctions or legislation limiting CO2 emissions, not just a tax that can be passed on to the consumer. Instead, I believe the government should invest more money into the research and development of sustainable alternatives to provide companies with. So whether or not you agree or disagree with a carbon tax, it is ultimately our responsibility to ensure the safety of our beloved Earth for future generations.
Tears are filling up their glasses. No expression, no expression. Hide my head, I wanna drown my sorrow.